Hey guys, tonight we are going to a place of incredible, breathtaking beauty. A place that is also the source of a deep and complex modern conflict. We are traveling to a magnificent, 1,000-year-old temple, perched on the edge of a cliff between Thailand and Cambodia. This is the story of Preah Vihear. Now, this is a more modern story than we usually tell here, and it deals with some sensitive and political history. Our approach, as always, will be a gentle and a quiet one. We're not here to shout or to take sides, but to try and understand the long, complicated story of how a sacred and peaceful place can become a symbol of national pride and a source of conflict. It is a story to be reflected upon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always a huge encouragement. For those of you already settled in, I'd love to see where and when you're listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and local time in the comments. I'm recording this in the very quiet, pre-dawn hours of a Friday morning, just after 5 a.m., here in Miami, Florida. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gentle whir of the fan fades, replaced by the sound of a soft, high wind whispering through ancient stones. Imagine you are standing on a mountaintop, long before the age of conflict, long before the modern world and its hard borders. You are at Preah Vihear, a sanctuary in the clouds. The air is thin and cool, and the world seems to stretch out below you into infinity. The temple is not a single building, but a long ascending pathway to the heavens. You are at the very top in the central sanctuary, but a series of 5 magnificent gateway pavilions or gopras lead down a spectacular 800-meter-long stone causeway, following the natural slope of the mountain. The architecture is a masterpiece of the Khmer Empire, built in the 11th and 12th centuries, a contemporary of the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. The sandstone is intricately carved with scenes from Hindu mythology, dedicated to the great god Shiva. It is a place built for silence. The only sounds are the wind, the distant call of a bird from the jungle far below, and the soft whisper of your own footsteps on the ancient, worn stone. It feels a million miles away from any kind of conflict, a place of pure, serene, and sacred peace. This great temple was a major pilgrimage site for the Khmer kings and their subjects. Its purpose was to be a symbolic representation of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the Hindu gods. Its unique, linear layout, climbing steadily up the mountain, is a physical representation of a spiritual journey, moving from the profane world below to the sacred world of the gods at the peak. Archaeologists and art historians debate the precise meaning of this layout. Was it purely symbolic, a journey to the heavens? Or did it also serve a practical defensive purpose, using the mountain's natural geography as part of a grand, fortified processional way? You walk to the edge of the sanctuary, and here you see the true breathtaking drama of the temple's location. The mountain ends. The world falls away beneath you in a sheer 1,000-foot cliff. From this precipice you can see the vast, flat, checkered plains of Cambodia, stretching out to the horizon like a great green ocean. The carvings on the temple tell the stories of the gods. You might see a beautifully preserved lintel depicting the famous Hindu creation myth, the churning of the ocean of milk, where the gods and the demons pull on a great serpent to churn the cosmic ocean and produce the elixir of immortality. The gods and demons in the carvings are locked in an eternal, cosmic struggle, but their stone faces are serene. They are part of a grand divine story, a story much older and larger than the temporary squabbles of men. When this temple was built, the modern nations of Thailand and Cambodia did not exist. The very concept of a hard political line drawn on a map was a much, much later invention. This was simply a great and holy temple in the heart of the vast Khmer Empire. For centuries, the people who lived on the gentle slopes to the north and the people who lived on the Great Plains to the south would have both looked up at this temple on the cliff, and they would have seen it not as a border, but as a shared, sacred landmark. The mountain did not divide them. It was a point of connection. You stand on the edge of the cliff for a long time, looking out over the vast Cambodian plain. Then you turn around and look back north up the long, gentle, sloping causeway, and you see how easy the path is from that direction. This simple, inescapable fact of geography, a steep, almost impassable cliff on one side, and a long, gentle, accessible slope on the other, is the seed of the entire, complex, and painful conflict that is to come. To understand the conflict over Preah Vihear, you must first understand the mountain itself. It is a place with two very different faces, a geographical paradox that has fueled the dispute for over a century. The temple sits atop the Dangrek Mountains, a range that functions as a great, long wall separating two distinct worlds. Imagine you are approaching the temple from the north, from the lands of the Kingdom of Thailand. The journey is a relatively gentle one. The land rises gradually, a high plateau covered in scrub and forest. You can walk, or in modern times drive up a gentle slope that leads you directly to the main entrance of the temple. The first and grandest of the gateway pavilions, the first of the great Naga-lined causeways, faces you. For all practical purposes of access, the temple feels as if it is in Thailand. It is a natural and easy extension of the land you are on. Now imagine you are standing on the southern side in the great flat plains of the Kingdom of Cambodia. You look up. The Dangrek Mountains are not a gentle slope from this direction. They are a colossal, sheer, and almost vertical cliff face, a wall of rock that rises hundreds of meters into the sky. And there, perched on the very edge of that impossible cliff, is the tiny, distant silhouette of Preah Vihear. From this perspective, the temple is remote, inaccessible, a sanctuary in the heavens. To reach it from this side requires a difficult, almost vertical climb up ancient, crumbling staircases. This is the heart of the problem. The temple is most easily reached from Thailand, and its grand entrance faces north. But its great windows, its most sacred sanctuaries, look out over, and were built by the ancestors of Cambodia. It is a place that physically connects to one nation, but architecturally and spiritually gazes upon the other. The central argument in the dispute has always been about the natural border. In international law, a border in a mountain range is often defined by the watershed line, the crest of the ridge, from which water flows down one side into one country, and down the other side into another. Thailand's argument has always been a simple and geographically intuitive one. The watershed line of the Dangrek Mountains is the main cliff edge. Water to the north flows into Thailand. Water to the south falls into Cambodia. If the border is the cliff edge, then the temple, which sits on top of that cliff, is rightfully and naturally on Thai soil. You can see the long stone causeways of the temple, which act as the main processional path for pilgrims. They are lined with beautiful balustrades carved in the shape of the Naga, the mythical multi-headed serpent. These Nagas are symbolic bridges, guiding the worshipper from the earthly realm up to the sacred, heavenly space of the temple. And this great Naga causeway, the main entrance to this Khmer masterpiece, begins on the gentle northern slope. So the very path that the ancient Khmer pilgrims walked to enter their holy site now begins in what is, today, a different country. The ancient spiritual geography and the modern political geography are in direct and painful conflict. Modern geographers and legal experts have used satellite imagery and advanced surveying techniques to try and map the precise watershed line. They debate the findings, with some studies supporting the Thai claim that the main watershed is the cliff edge, while other studies support a slightly different line further to the north, the very line that would appear on a fateful French map. The natural border, it turns out, is itself a subject of intense scientific and political interpretation. This unique geography creates two powerful, sincere, and completely contradictory feelings of ownership. From a Thai perspective, the temple is on our land. We can walk to it. Its entrance is here. It is a part of our territory. From a Cambodian perspective, the temple is the magnificent legacy of our Khmer ancestors. It looks out over our homeland. It is the spiritual guardian of our northern plains. It is a situation that seems almost perfectly designed to create a dispute, a shared sacred treasure, placed directly on a contested line. Both sides can look at the same mountain, the same stones, and with complete and honest conviction, feel that it belongs to them. But for many, many centuries, this geographical paradox did not matter. The mountain was a landmark, not a hard border. The great empires of the past ebbed and flowed, but the temple remained. And for the ordinary people who lived in its shadow, it was simply a holy place. It was a site of shared pilgrimage. Let us leave for a moment the modern world of legal disputes, of nationalism, and of lines on a map. Let us drift back in time to the centuries after the great Khmer kings had passed into legend, but before the European powers arrived in Southeast Asia. Let us visit the temple in an age when the mountain was not a barrier, but a destination. Imagine you are a pilgrim in the 16th century. You have walked for many days to reach this sacred mountain. Perhaps you are a Khmer rice farmer from the Great Plains to the south, and you have made the arduous, sweat-soaked climb up the steep cliffside path as an act of devotion. Or perhaps you are a Siamese silk merchant from the Karat Plateau to the north, and you have made the long, gentle ascent through the forest. You arrive at the temple, and you are not alone. The stone causeways are dotted with other families, other pilgrims. The people around you speak different languages, wear slightly different clothes, but you are all here for the same reason. You have come to make an offering, to say a prayer, to be in the presence of the divine. In this era, a person's identity was likely more tied to their local village, their regional lord, or their specific religious tradition than to a great, abstract concept like a nation. The idea that you were Cambodian, and the man kneeling next to you was Thai, would have been a strange and largely unimportant distinction. You were both simply pilgrims, come to honor the ancient and powerful spirits of this sacred mountain. The temple itself was a testament to this shared, fluid faith. It was built as a grand sanctuary to the Hindu god Shiva. The central and most holy object would have been a linga, a symbolic stone representation of Shiva's creative power. But by this time, the religious landscape of the region had changed. Theravada Buddhism had become the dominant faith for both the Khmer and the Siamese peoples. And so the temple was adapted. Preah Vihear is a perfect example of the religious syncretism that is a hallmark of Southeast Asian history. Buddhist pilgrims would come here, and they would see the great Hindu gods carved on the walls not as alien deities, but perhaps as powerful local spirits or devas, who had been incorporated into their own worldview. Buddhist statues were placed in the sanctuaries alongside the older Hindu iconography. The gods themselves were adaptable. The great Shiva might be seen as a guardian of the Buddha's teachings. Faith, like the jungle vines that grew on the ancient stones, found ways to grow together, to intertwine. You watch as a family from the north leaves a simple offering of fragrant jasmine flowers and incense at a small shrine. You watch as a family from the south leaves an offering of rice and bananas. It is a scene not of grand state ceremony, but of quiet, personal, and peaceful devotion. Historians debate the precise political status of the temple during these intervening centuries, after the decline of the Great Khmer Empire and before the arrival of the French. Did the rising Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya act as a formal patron and protector of the temple, which was now more easily accessible from its sphere of influence? Or was the temple largely left to the care of local communities, existing in a kind of peaceful political no man's land between the two great kingdoms? Whatever the political reality, for the ordinary people, the temple was a fixed point in their spiritual universe. The journey itself, the pilgrimage, was a vital part of the experience. The long, hot walk, the strenuous climb for those coming from the Cambodian plain, was a physical act of devotion that cleansed the spirit and prepared the pilgrim for their encounter with the sacred for centuries. This was the reality of Preah Vihear. It was a place where people came together. It was a shared heritage, its meaning layered and adaptable, its spiritual power transcending the shifting politics of the lowlands. But a new age was dawning, an age that was obsessed with precision, with science, and with the drawing of clear, unambiguous, and permanent lines. an age that would take this fluid, shared world and force it to conform to the rigid geometry of a map. The colonial powers of Europe were arriving, and with them they brought a new and terrible kind of clarity. That world of quiet, shared pilgrimage, where the mountain was a landmark and not a border, could only exist because the political landscape around it was in a long, slow state of transition. To understand the lines that would eventually be drawn by the Europeans, we must first understand the great empires that rose and fell in this land, and the shifting tides of power that defined their history. The temple of Preah Vihear was born at the very peak of one of the most magnificent civilizations in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire. Imagine you are standing on this mountain not in a later, quieter age, but during the 11th or 12th century. The air is alive with the sounds of construction, the chip of chisels on sandstone, the chants of priests. This is the age of Angkor at its zenith. The Khmer Empire was the dominant power in the region, a vast and sophisticated kingdom renowned for its incredible artistic achievements and its monumental feats of engineering. The construction of a grand temple complex like this one, on such a remote and dramatic clifftop, was a powerful statement. It was a northern bastion of the empire's religious and political authority, a symbol of Khmer power and piety, visible for 100 miles. But empires, like the great ancient trees of the jungle, have a life cycle. They grow for centuries, their influence casting a vast shadow, and then slowly they begin to wither. From the 13th century onwards, the power of the Great Khmer Empire began its long, slow decline. The reasons are complex and still debated by historians, but they likely include a combination of factors: internal power struggles, the strain of constant warfare with its neighbors, and perhaps a series of prolonged droughts that challenged the water-based agricultural systems that sustained their great cities. And as the great tree of Angkor began to wither, its fall created the space and the sunlight for new trees to rise and reach for the sky. The most powerful of these rising neighbors was the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya, to the west. As the power of the Khmer weakened, the Thai-speaking peoples consolidated their power. The kingdom of Ayutthaya grew strong, wealthy, and ambitious, and it began to challenge the Khmer for control of the region, slowly absorbing the western territories of the old empire. The political and cultural center of gravity in mainland Southeast Asia began to shift, from Angkor in the east to Ayutthaya in the west. It is during this long period of transition, from the 14th to the 18th centuries, that the political status of Preah Vihear becomes ambiguous. It was, without question, a masterpiece of the old Khmer civilization, but it was now located in a remote frontier zone that was increasingly falling under the influence, if not the direct control, of the rising Siamese kingdom. The great kings in their golden palaces could draw lines on imaginary maps and claim dominion over vast territories. But on the ground, in a remote mountain range, life was more complex. The people living here, whether they spoke Khmer or a Thai dialect, likely paid tribute and respect to whichever army had marched through most recently, or sometimes to both. Historians of Southeast Asia debate the true nature of this power shift. Was it a dramatic and violent conquest of Khmer lands by the Siamese armies? Or was it a more gradual and subtle process of cultural and political assimilation, where local lords and populations in these frontier territories slowly shifted their allegiance to the new, more dynamic and more powerful Siamese kingdom over many generations? This was the complex, layered, and fluid political world that existed before the arrival of the European colonial powers. It was a world of overlapping spheres of influence, of porous and shifting frontiers, and of a deeply intertwined cultural and religious heritage between the Khmer and Thai peoples. It was a world that did not fit neatly into the simple, clear-cut boxes of a modern political map. And that was a problem that the mapmakers of Europe, with their deep love of order and straight lines, believed they were destined to fix. And so, into this ancient, complex, and fluid world, a new and profoundly disruptive force arrived in the 19th century. A force from half a world away. A force that would bring with it a new kind of power, and a new obsession with drawing lines upon the land. It was the dawn of the French colonial empire in Indochina. The arrival of the French in Indochina changes everything. The old fluid world of shifting allegiances and porous frontiers is gone. Now a new and powerful European player is in the region. A player that demands clarity, order, and precision. It demands borders. It demands unambiguous lines drawn on a map. Imagine you are in the royal court at Bangkok in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Kingdom of Siam, as Thailand was then known, is in a deeply precarious position. It is the last independent kingdom in a region being rapidly carved up by European colonial powers. To the west, the British Empire has conquered Burma and controls Malaya. To the east and south, the French have established their colonial empire of French Indochina, encompassing Vietnam, Laos, and the Protectorate of Cambodia. Siam is caught in the middle. The great Siamese king of this era, Chulalongkorn or Rama V, is playing a brilliant and desperate diplomatic game to maintain his kingdom's sovereignty. Part of this game involves negotiating and formally defining his kingdom's borders with the two European giants on his doorstep. This was a process fraught with pressure and unequal power. In 1904, Siam and France signed a treaty to settle their disputes and formally delineate the long and often ill-defined border that ran along the Dangrek Mountains. The treaty was, on its surface, a model of rational modern thinking. It stipulated a clear and scientific principle for drawing the border in this mountainous region. The border would follow the watershed line. This is a standard and logical principle of international geography. The watershed is the natural high-elevation crest of a mountain range. All the land from which water flows north, in this case into Siam's Mun River Basin, would belong to Siam. All the land from which water flows south, onto the Great Cambodian Plain, would belong to French Cambodia. It all sounds perfectly simple and fair. It is a very civilized solution. The only problem is that someone still has to go out into the dense, dangerous, and almost impassable jungle and actually survey the land to draw the map. To this end, a mixed commission was established with officials from both France and Siam. However, the Siamese government at the time lacked its own corps of trained surveyors and cartographers with the technical skills to produce the kind of modern, topographically precise maps the French demanded. As a result, the difficult, practical, on-the-ground work of surveying the remote terrain and producing the final, official maps fell almost entirely to the French military officers on the commission. You can imagine the difficulty of their task. These French surveyors, sweating in their heavy colonial uniforms, would have been battling malaria, dysentery, incredible heat, and a jungle so thick they might only be able to advance a few hundred yards a day. They were trying to make precise scientific measurements with heavy, delicate, and often unreliable equipment. It is not surprising that in this vast, difficult landscape, a few small errors might find their way onto the final map. Historians still debate the true intentions of the French cartographers who surveyed the Preah Vihear area. Was the eventual crucial error on the map a genuine accidental mistake, the result of the incredibly difficult terrain and the imprecise surveying techniques of the era? Or was it a quiet, deliberate, and strategic act of cartographic aggression by the French colonial authorities? A subtle redrawing of the line to ensure the famous and symbolically important temple fell on their side of the border, thereby enhancing the prestige and historical claim of their Cambodian protectorate. This is the moment, a quiet, technical, almost boring moment, that will be the seed of a century of conflict. It is a moment in a hot, dusty tent in the middle of the jungle, where a man with a pen and a ruler draws a line on a map that is just a few millimeters off from where the laws of nature say it should be. But on the ground, those few millimeters of ink represent a mountain, a magnificent temple, and the future pride of two nations. The French Commission eventually completed its work. They produced a series of 11 beautiful, detailed, and official-looking maps of the entire border region. These were presented to the Siamese government. One of these maps, the one designated Annex I, showed the border in the area of Preah Vihear, and the line on that map did not follow the watershed. The maps are delivered to the Siamese government in Bangkok. They are beautiful examples of late colonial era cartography, filled with precise topographical lines, elegant French script, and the confident scientific authority of the age. But one of them, the one that covers the Dangrek Mountains, contains a quiet, fateful deviation. It is the map that will become known to the world as Annex I. Imagine you are an official in the Siamese court, looking at this map for the first time. For most of its length, the border it depicts follows the high, dramatic escarpment of the mountain range, just as the treaty and the principle of the watershed would suggest. But as your finger traces the line to the specific area of the Preah Vihear temple, you see the anomaly. The line, instead of continuing along the natural crest of the cliff, makes a small but distinct northward bulge. It is not a large deviation. It is a subtle curve of ink on a piece of paper. But this small curve perfectly and neatly encloses the entire promontory on which the ancient temple stands. It takes the temple and the easy access route from the north and places it squarely on the southern Cambodian side of the border. The map, produced entirely by French officers, directly contradicts the watershed principle that the French themselves had agreed to in the treaty. This is the fateful error, the single most important piece of evidence in the entire century-long dispute. It's a tiny detail on a very large map, a little bubble of ink where a straight line ought to be. But this small cartographic decision, whether it was made by accident or by design, would become the legal and emotional heart of the conflict for the next 100 years. The creation of maps in the colonial era was a powerful act. For European empires, mapping a territory was a fundamental part of claiming and controlling it. A precise, scientific-looking map was a tool of power. It transformed a complex, fluid, and often culturally ambiguous landscape into a neat, governable space with clearly defined, manageable edges. The French were masters of this art. To the French, a border was, above all, a clear line on a map. To the Siamese and Khmer peoples, a border had traditionally been a more fluid and porous zone of influence. The conflict, in a way, is a clash between these two very different ways of seeing the land. Historians of cartography still debate the political influences on mapmaking during this period. To what extent were maps neutral scientific documents, as they claimed to be? And to what extent were they political tools, used to legitimize colonial claims and create convenient administrative boundaries, often with little regard for the ethnic, cultural, or geographical realities on the ground? The mountain itself had not moved. The temple had not moved. The direction that water flowed from the crest had not changed. But something fundamental had shifted. A new official story had been written down in the powerful authoritative language of cartography. And this story, a story that favored the claims of France's Cambodian protectorate, would prove to be very, very difficult to erase. The map, with its fateful error, was now complete. It was published in Paris and formally presented to the Siamese government as the official and final result of the Border Commission's work. The French had presented their version of reality. The crucial question now was, what would Siam do? Would they scrutinize this map, compare it to the treaty's text, and lodge a formal protest against this clear deviation? Or would they, for reasons of diplomacy, distraction, or simple oversight, remain silent? The fate of the temple on the mountain now rested not on the surveyors in the jungle, but on the politicians in their quiet, teak-paneled offices in Bangkok. The French map, with its small but significant deviation, lies on a polished teak table in a government ministry in Bangkok. The year is 1908. The Kingdom of Siam, a nation walking a tightrope of survival between two colonial giants, is faced with a choice: to protest this cartographic error, or to accept it. They choose silence. There is no angry diplomatic note sent to Paris. There is no official challenge to the findings of the French surveyors. Instead, the Siamese government formally receives the maps, thanks the French for their work, and proceeds to request and circulate copies for the use of its own provincial governors. For the next 50 years, this French-drawn map, with its northward bulge enclosing Preah Vihear, becomes the de facto official map of the region for both parties. This quiet, bureaucratic moment of inaction is, in many ways, the most important event in the entire dispute. It is the moment that will be argued over, analyzed, and debated for the next century. Why did the proud and diplomatically savvy Siamese court remain silent? The reasons are complex, a mixture of pragmatism and circumstance. The primary goal of King Chulalongkorn and his government was the preservation of Siam's very existence as an independent nation. They were engaged in a high-stakes diplomatic game with France, a power that had already forced them to cede vast territories in Laos and Cambodia. To pick a fight over a remote, jungle-clad temple on a disputed border may have seemed like a foolish and dangerous risk, a provocation that could lead to even greater losses. It is one of history's great what-ifs. What if a junior, eagle-eyed official in the Siamese Foreign Ministry had noticed the discrepancy, compared it to the text of the 1904 treaty, and drafted a simple letter of protest? The entire future of the temple, and a significant chapter in Thai-Cambodian relations, might have been completely different. But the letter was never written. The most famous and powerful evidence of this quiet acceptance came decades later, in 1930. The highly respected and influential Thai Prince Damrong Rajanapab, a historian and former minister, paid a scholarly visit to the temple. When he arrived at the site via the gentle northern slope, he was formally welcomed by the French resident of the Cambodian province. The French tricolor flag was flying over the temple's main sanctuary. The prince, an official guest of the French in what was, according to all the maps, French territory, made no protest. He simply enjoyed his tour, admiring the magnificent Khmer architecture. He had no way of knowing that his polite, scholarly silence on that day would, 30 years later, become a cornerstone of Cambodia's legal argument at the World Court. Historians still debate the internal politics of the Siamese court at this time. Was the lack of protest a deliberate strategic sacrifice made by a king who was willing to give up a remote temple in exchange for a more stable and peaceful relationship with his powerful French neighbor? Or was it, as the Thais would later argue, a simple bureaucratic oversight, a minor error on a single map that went unnoticed by an overstretched administration that was focused on much larger and more pressing domestic reforms? Whatever the reason, for half a century, the line on the map slowly hardened into an accepted reality. It was published in international atlases. It was used by administrators on both sides of the border. This is how borders are often made. Not always through great battles or grand treaties, but through the slow, quiet, and relentless power of paperwork. A map is created, it is used, it is filed away, and over time its lines become as hard and real as any mountain range. This quiet status quo, however, depended on the continued presence of the French colonial empire. And in the middle of the 20th century, the great empires of Europe began to crumble. The Second World War, the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, and the wave of post-war independence movements would change the map of the world once again. The French would leave Indochina. Cambodia would become a free and independent nation. And the old, dormant, paper-based disagreement over the temple on the mountain was about to be reborn as a passionate and very real political conflict. The great colonial empires of Europe, which had seemed so permanent and powerful, were shattered by the Second World War. In the years that followed, a wave of independence movements swept across Asia and Africa. In 1953, after a long and complex struggle, the Kingdom of Cambodia gained its full independence from France. The French tricolor flag was lowered for the last time. A new post-colonial era had begun. This shift in the global order had immediate and profound consequences for the quiet mountain temple. The border was no longer a line between the independent Kingdom of Thailand and the mighty French Empire. It was now a direct border between two proud, sovereign, and newly equal Southeast Asian nations. And the old, dormant disagreement about Preah Vihear, which had been suppressed for decades by the weight of colonial power, was about to awaken. The newly independent Cambodia, under the charismatic and assertive leadership of its young king Norodom Sihanouk, was eager to establish and defend the full extent of its sovereign territory. They looked at the legal framework they had inherited from the French, which included the Annex I map, and they saw Preah Vihear as an integral and undeniable part of their nation. It was a magnificent symbol of the golden age of their Khmer ancestors, and a powerful statement of their new modern independence. Thailand, however, saw the departure of the French as a long-awaited opportunity to correct what they had always considered a historical injustice. With the powerful colonial authority gone, they argued that the flawed, French-drawn map should be considered null and void. The true and natural border, the watershed line along the crest of the cliff, should finally be implemented. They saw the temple as rightfully theirs, based on geography, on history, and on the simple fact of its easy access from their side of the mountain. The simmering dispute did not remain a matter of diplomatic notes for long. In 1954, just a year after Cambodian independence, the last French troops who had been stationed in the remote border region withdrew. Thailand immediately took advantage of this power vacuum. They sent their own police and military personnel up the gentle northern slope and stationed them at the temple, physically occupying the ancient site for 50 years. The dispute had been a quiet, theoretical argument about a line on a piece of paper. Now, it had become a real and tangible argument about soldiers and flags on a mountaintop. The abstract had become very, very real. Years of tense and fruitless diplomatic negotiations followed. Cambodia, the smaller and militarily weaker of the two nations, lodged formal protests against the Thai occupation. Thailand, now in physical possession of the temple, refused to leave. Historians often debate the domestic political motivations that fueled this escalation in the 1950s. Was it purely a matter of national honor and a sincere belief in their historical claims on both sides? Or were the leaders of both nations, the powerful military government in Thailand and the royalist government in Cambodia, using the patriotic fervor of the border dispute as a useful tool to rally public support and solidify their own power bases at home during a period of political uncertainty? The Cambodian leader, Prince Sihanouk, was a master of using the international stage to his advantage. He knew that his small country could not win a military conflict with Thailand, so he decided to challenge them on a different battlefield, one where the size of your army was irrelevant. He chose the battlefield of international law. It was a classic David and Goliath strategy, a small newly born nation deciding to take on its larger neighbor, not with soldiers but with lawyers. It was a bold and very modern move. After years of getting nowhere in bilateral talks, in October of 1959, the Cambodian government made its momentous decision. They would formally sue the Kingdom of Thailand in the highest court on the planet, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. This was an enormous gamble. It meant taking a deeply personal regional dispute, rooted in centuries of shared history and cultural nuance, and handing it over to a panel of judges from distant countries who had no personal stake in the outcome. The fate of the sacred mountain, a place of immense spiritual and national importance to both the Thai and Khmer peoples, was about to be decided by men in a grand, marble-floored palace in the Netherlands. The quiet, jungle-covered temple was about to become an international legal sensation. The decision has been made. The case has been filed. Our story now moves from the hot, tense, jungle-clad border of Southeast Asia to a cool, quiet, and profoundly formal room in Europe. Imagine you are in the Great Hall of Justice in the Peace Palace in The Hague, Netherlands. The year is 1961. The high vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows, and dark wood paneling create an atmosphere of immense and solemn gravity. The great legal battle for the soul of an ancient temple is about to begin. At the head of the room, seated behind a long, imposing bench, is the panel of 15 distinguished international judges in their black robes, men from all corners of the globe. On either side of the hall sit the legal delegations from the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Kingdom of Thailand. This is no small-time local dispute. Both nations have hired some of the most formidable legal minds of the era. Cambodia's team is led by a former American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. Thailand's is led by a former British Attorney General, Sir Frank Soskis. This is the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It is the highest court in the world, the place where nations come to settle their disputes with arguments instead of armies. Its verdicts are legally binding. The atmosphere is one of quiet, intense, and deeply intellectual combat. There is no shouting, no emotional outbursts. The arguments are made in calm, measured tones, referencing obscure colonial treaties, complex points of international law, and dusty historical documents. It is a world away from the passionate, nationalist protests in the streets of Bangkok or Phnom Penh. Here, the fate of the sacred mountain will be decided not by emotion, but by evidence, not by soldiers but by scholars. It is a battle of footnotes and legal interpretations. The central question before the court is a fascinating one. Is the border between the two nations defined by the clear scientific principle of the watershed line, as laid out in the text of the 1904 treaty? Or is it defined by the line on the 1907 map, a map which both parties used without formal protest for half a century? You can imagine the judges, men from countries as far away as Argentina and the Soviet Union, poring over these old, delicate French maps, trying to understand the history of a remote temple they have never seen. It is like being asked to solve a very old, very complicated, and very important puzzle, with the pride of two nations as the prize. Legal scholars see this case as a classic clash of two fundamental principles of international law. On one hand, there is the principle of pacta sunt servanda, which means treaties must be respected. This supported Thailand's argument that the watershed principle in the original treaty was the ultimate law. On the other hand, there is the principle of estoppel or acquiescence, which supported Cambodia's argument that Thailand's long acceptance of the map had created a new, binding legal reality. It is a strange and very modern scene. The future of an ancient Hindu temple, built by a long-dead Khmer king in the heart of Southeast Asia, is being debated in French and English, according to European legal traditions, by an American and a British lawyer, in front of a panel of international judges, in a palace in the Netherlands. It is a true picture of a complex, globalized world. The preliminary statements are concluded. The president of the court, a judge from Poland, looks down from the bench. The great hall is silent. He now invites the counsel for the applicant, the Kingdom of Cambodia, to present its primary argument to the court. The trial proper has begun. The president of the court gives a quiet nod, and a distinguished, gray-haired man rises slowly to his feet. He is Dean Acheson, the former United States Secretary of State, a titan of Cold War diplomacy, now acting as the lead counsel for the Kingdom of Cambodia. He approaches the lectern and in a calm, measured, and deeply scholarly tone, the case for Cambodia begins to unfold. The argument he presents is a masterpiece of legal strategy, elegant in its simplicity. He does not begin by arguing about ancient history. He does not present complex geographical surveys. He begins by agreeing with Thailand on the first point. The 1904 treaty did indeed state that the border should follow the watershed line. But then he makes his crucial move. He argues that the treaty was just the beginning of the process. The purpose of the mixed commission, he explains, was to take the general principle of the treaty and apply it to the land itself, to survey it, and to produce a definitive map. And that, he says, is exactly what they did. He presents to the court the now famous Annex I map of 1907. This map, he argues, was the official final product of the treaty's work. Then comes the heart of his entire case, the argument that will decide the fate of the temple. He begins to painstakingly, and for the Thai delegation painfully, lay out the history of the 50 years after the map was created. He presents evidence that the map was formally transmitted by the French authorities to the Siamese government in Bangkok. The Siamese government, he shows, never once lodged a formal protest or questioned the line that was drawn. On the contrary, he produces letters showing that the Siamese government had requested additional copies of this very map for its own use. He shows that the map was published in widely available atlases and was, for half a century, the only official map of the region in existence. And then he delivers the most powerful piece of evidence, the story of Prince Damrong's visit in 1930. He presents the official records, showing that the Thai prince was greeted by the French resident under the French flag. He was, in every sense, a state guest visiting a site in what his own government clearly accepted as French territory. The legal principle Cambodia was arguing is known as estoppel by acquiescence. It is a quiet but devastating legal idea. It means that if a state knows about a situation and has every opportunity to protest it, but instead remains silent and acts in a way that suggests it accepts the situation, then it is estopped, or legally prevented, from denying that situation at a later date. Cambodia's argument was essentially this. Perhaps the map was wrong when it was first drawn, but for 50 years you acted as if it were right. You led us and the entire world to believe you agreed with it. It is too late in 1962 to suddenly change your mind. It is a strange and quiet battlefield. The weapons are not swords and spears, but dusty archival documents and 50-year-old letters. The killing blow is not a violent act, but a well-preserved thank you note in which a Siamese official politely thanks the French for providing him with copies of the very map now in dispute. Legal scholars often debate the role of colonialism in this argument. Was it truly fair for the court to hold Siam, a relatively weak kingdom under immense diplomatic pressure, to the same rigorous standard of protest as it would a major European power? Did Siam's failure to object really represent free and willing consent, or was it a pragmatic choice made under the duress of colonial power politics? For the Cambodian delegation, the map was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of their very identity as a modern nation. It was the birth certificate of their modern borders, the legal document that defined their sovereign space in the post-colonial world. To challenge the map was to challenge the very foundation of their statehood. Atchison concludes his presentation. The Cambodian case rests. It is a powerful, logical, and deeply researched argument based not on the emotions of history or the contours of geography, but on the cold, hard record of state behavior. The judges listen, their faces impassive. The court takes a recess, and when they return, it will be Thailand's turn to tell their very different story. The court reconvenes. The Cambodian case, with its quiet, methodical focus on maps and 50 years of silence, hangs in the air. Now, a different, equally distinguished lawyer, Sir Frank Soskis, a former Attorney General for the United Kingdom, rises to his feet. It is time to present Thailand's argument, an argument based on a very different and very powerful idea of truth. If Cambodia's case was the map is the law, Thailand's was nature is the law. Sir Frank did not begin by disputing the history of his country's silence. He began by going back to the source, the 1904 treaty itself. This treaty, he argued, was the only truly binding legal document in the entire dispute. And the text of that treaty was perfectly clear. It stated, without ambiguity, that the border in the Dangrek Mountains was to follow the watershed line. He then turned his attention to the now infamous Annex I map. This map, he argued, was not a treaty in itself. It was merely a document intended to illustrate the terms of the treaty, and it had failed in that task. He presented detailed geographical surveys and the testimony of expert topographers, all intended to prove one simple physical fact. The line on the French map did not follow the natural watershed line. The true watershed, he argued, was the very edge of the great cliff face. Therefore, his argument was simple. The map contained a clear and demonstrable error, and an error, no matter how old, cannot be allowed to become the law. The text of the treaty, he insisted, must be paramount. It was a powerful and deeply intuitive argument. Thailand was essentially saying to the judges, look at the mountain. The mountain itself tells you where the border should be. Are you going to believe the physical, scientific reality of the earth? Or are you going to believe a 50-year-old piece of paper with a wobbly line on it, drawn by a colonial officer in a hurry? Of course, the Thai legal team had to address the difficult question of their 50 years of inaction. They argued that their government in the early 20th century was in an extremely weak diplomatic position, under immense pressure from the French. They claimed that Siam at the time simply lacked the technical, cartographic expertise to confidently challenge the scientific maps produced by the French Commission. Their silence, they argued, was not a signal of their consent. It was a consequence of their relative weakness and their inability to prove the error at the time. The entire case was a fascinating window into different ways of thinking about truth. Is truth something that is created over time through human action and agreement, as Cambodia argued? Or is truth a permanent, pre-existing reality, a fact of nature, that we must simply try to discover and respect, as Thailand argued? The court was being asked to decide not just the fate of a temple, but the very philosophy of law itself. Historians still debate the strength of Thailand's "we didn't know any better" argument. Was the highly sophisticated Siamese court of King Chulalongkorn, a court famous for its diplomatic skill, truly unaware of the map's error and its long-term implications? Or did they, in fact, make a calculated political decision at the time to let the matter go? A decision that their more nationalistic successors in the 1960s would come to bitterly regret and try to reverse. For the Thai people, this was not a legal abstraction. It was a simple physical reality. You can walk from their land up a gentle, unbroken slope and arrive at the temple's main entrance. The idea that you have just crossed a major international border somewhere on that path seems to them completely absurd. Sir Frank Soskis concludes his presentation. The Thai case rests. The court has now heard two brilliant, compelling, and completely contradictory stories. One, a story about the power of precedent and the legal weight of a nation's own behavior. The other, a story about the primacy of treaties and the unchangeable truth of the natural world. The legal arguments are over. The judges, their faces impassive, rise and retreat to their chambers to begin their long, secret deliberations. The time for argument has ended. The time for judgment is now at hand. The waiting is over. On the 15th of June 1962, the judges of the International Court of Justice file back into the Great Hall of Justice in the Peace Palace. The representatives of Cambodia and Thailand, their faces etched with a profound and nervous anticipation, take their seats. A deep silence falls over the grand courtroom. The time for judgment has come. The president of the court begins to read the judgment. The language is dense, formal, and filled with the careful, precise vocabulary of international law, but its conclusion, when it arrives, is sharp, clear, and decisive. By a vote of 9-3, the court found that the temple of Preah Vihear was situated in territory under the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Cambodia. The court then ordered the Kingdom of Thailand to withdraw any military or police forces it had stationed at the temple or in its vicinity. And finally, it ordered Thailand to return to Cambodia any sculptures or other artifacts it may have removed from the temple during its years of occupation. It was a comprehensive and almost total victory for Cambodia. The court's reasoning, laid out in its long and detailed judgment, is a fascinating journey into the heart of international law. The judges, in their majority opinion, actually acknowledged the strength of Thailand's geographical argument. They agreed that the Annex I map, drawn by the French back in 1907, probably did contain an error and likely did not follow the true watershed line as was stipulated in the original 1904 treaty, however, and this was the single crucial point upon which the entire case turned. The court found that the initial accuracy of the map was no longer the most important legal question. The most important question was how the two nations, particularly Siam, had behaved in the 50 years after the map was created. The court concluded that Thailand's failure to protest the map for half a century, combined with its active use of the map and the actions of its high-ranking officials like Prince Damrong, constituted a legally binding acceptance of that border. In the court's famous phrase, Thailand was now precluded by her conduct from rejecting the frontier that it had, for so long, treated as a reality. It was a decision that reverberated through the world of international law. The court had essentially ruled that stability and the historical, demonstrated acceptance of a border were more important than a geographical or scientific truth that was raised decades after the fact. It was a powerful lesson in international relations. A nation's silence over a long enough period can become a form of speech. It can become a binding agreement. The verdict was not unanimous. 3 of the 15 judges issued strong dissenting opinions, arguing passionately that the clear scientific principle of the watershed line in the original treaty should have been the supreme consideration, and that a known error on a map should not be allowed to create a legal fiction on the ground. The 1962 verdict remains one of the most analyzed and debated cases in the history of the World Court. Did the judges correctly uphold the vital principle of border stability, preventing a dangerous precedent where old, accepted maps could be challenged at any time based on new surveys? Or did they, as the dissenting judges argued, reward a colonial-era injustice and create a permanent grievance that would inevitably lead to future conflict? In the quiet, wood-paneled courtroom in The Hague, a judgment is read. It is a decision based on decades of quiet, bureaucratic inaction and forgotten diplomatic letters. But its impact, thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia, will be anything but quiet. It will be received as a shout of pure national joy, and as a deep cry of national mourning. The legal battle is over. The gavel has fallen. The decision is final and without appeal. Now, the abstract words of the judges in Europe must be translated into real-world action on the sacred mountain itself. The news of the verdict travels by telegraph and radio, a ripple of judgment spreading across the globe from the cool courts of Europe to the hot, humid capitals of Southeast Asia. The abstract legal decision, argued over with footnotes and precedents, is about to become a very real, very tangible, and very emotional event on the ground. Imagine you are at the temple again, in the weeks following the decision in the summer of 1962. The air is thick with a tense, formal silence. In full compliance with the World Court's ruling, the Thai police and border guards, who have considered themselves the protectors of this site for nearly a decade, are preparing to leave. You watch as they conduct a final, somber ceremony. They respectfully lower the flag of Thailand, fold it with precise military discipline, and then march in a quiet, orderly column back down the gentle northern slope into their own country. Their withdrawal is peaceful, correct, and filled with a palpable sense of national sorrow and quiet dignity. A short time later, a different group arrives, not by the easy path, but by the hard one. The Cambodian soldiers and officials have made the arduous and symbolic climb up the steep southern cliff face from the plains below. They are, in a very real and physical sense, ascending to reclaim a part of their heritage that they felt had been unjustly taken. And then comes the great triumphal moment for Cambodia. On the highest point of the central sanctuary, overlooking the vast plains, the national flag of the Kingdom of Cambodia is raised. It catches the strong mountain breeze and unfurls against the blue sky, a clear, unambiguous, and legally sanctioned statement of sovereignty. For the Cambodian officials present, it is a moment of immense, almost tearful pride. The reaction in the two national capitals could not be more starkly different. In Phnom Penh, there are jubilant celebrations in the streets. The verdict is hailed as a great victory for the diplomacy of their leader, Prince Sihanouk, and a validation of the rights of a smaller nation on the world stage. It is seen as the rightful return of a sacred jewel of their ancient Khmer culture. In Bangkok, the mood is one of shock, anger, and national humiliation. The government declares a day of national mourning. Flags across the kingdom are flown at half-mast. Mass student protests erupt, decrying the verdict as an injustice, a betrayal, a wound inflicted by a distant and uncomprehending court. The loss of the temple, Khao Phraya Han, becomes a powerful and enduring symbol of national grievance. For Cambodia, it was a day of joyous rebirth. For Thailand, it was a day of bitter loss. The ancient temple had become a mirror, reflecting the deeply held feelings of national identity of two proud peoples. The verdict even spawned its own cultural legacy. In Thailand, a wave of popular, patriotic, and deeply sorrowful songs were written about the loss of Preah Vihear. These songs became enduring hits, played on the radio for decades, helping to cement the temple as a lost treasure in the Thai popular imagination. It's a fascinating example of how a political event can be kept alive through culture. While diplomats may sign treaties, a sad patriotic song can keep a sense of injustice fresh in the hearts of ordinary people for generations. Political scientists see this moment as the crystallization of the dispute in the modern consciousness of both nations. They debate whether the winner-take-all nature of the court's verdict, by creating a clear victor and a clear vanquished, actually made future compromise and cooperation more difficult, by hardening the nationalist positions on both sides. Crucially, the court's ruling, while decisive, had left a dangerous ambiguity. It had ruled on the sovereignty of the temple promontory itself, based on the line on the map, but it had not formally and precisely delineated the entire border in the surrounding jungle-covered land. The court had given the house to Cambodia, but the ownership of the driveway and the front garden was still, in a way, up for debate. It was a detail that seemed small at the time, but it would become the source of new and even more dangerous arguments 50 years later. For now, however, a tense but stable new reality settled in. The flag was raised. The ownership for the moment was settled. An uneasy peace returned to the mountain. But the wider region was about to descend into a period of immense violence and chaos that would change everything, and make the quiet dispute over a pile of ancient stones seem, for a very long time, like a distant and almost trivial memory. The uneasy peace on the mountain, established by the World Court's decision, did not last. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the fires of a much larger and more terrible conflict, the Vietnam War, began to spill over into neutral Cambodia, plunging the country into a long and brutal civil war. The quiet, remote, and sacred temple of Preah Vihear was about to become a strategic military prize. Its unique geography, the very thing that made it so beautiful, also made it a perfect natural fortress. The high, sheer cliff offered a commanding and almost unassailable position, with a clear view for many miles over the flat northern plains of Cambodia. An army that held Preah Vihear controlled the entire surrounding region. Throughout the Cambodian Civil War, the temple changed hands several times. It was held by the forces of the US-backed Khmer Republic, and then in 1975 it was captured by the victorious communist forces of the Khmer Rouge as they completed their conquest of the country. What followed was one of the darkest and most tragic chapters of the 20th century. The Khmer Rouge regime, led by the dictator Pol Pot, imposed a brutal ultra-Maoist ideology on the nation. They emptied the cities, abolished money and private property, and declared war on intellectuals, artists, and anyone with an education. In the 4 years they were in power, an estimated 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the entire population, died from starvation, disease, overwork, and mass executions in the infamous killing fields. The temple, once a place of healing and spiritual journeys, now stood as a silent witness to a nation's unimaginable agony on the plains below. In late 1978, the neighboring nation of Vietnam invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge regime. But the war was not over. The remnants of the Khmer Rouge army were not defeated. They fled to remote, inaccessible parts of the country to wage a long and bloody guerrilla war. And their most famous and final stronghold was here, at the Temple of Preah Vihear. For many years, well into the 1990s, a pocket of die-hard Khmer Rouge fighters held out on the sacred mountain, using its magnificent, defensible gateway pavilions as machine gun nests and its ancient causeways as trenches. The beautiful sanctuary in the clouds had become a fortress for the architects of a genocide. It is one of the most bitter and painful ironies in the temple's long history. During this period, the Kingdom of Thailand was in a difficult position. As part of the complex geopolitics of the Cold War, Thailand and many other nations did not recognize the new Vietnamese-backed government in Cambodia. For a time, they tacitly allowed the Khmer Rouge forces to use Thai territory near the border for sanctuary and for receiving supplies. This meant that the entire Preah Vihear area remained an active and dangerous conflict zone for almost 2 decades. Historians and political analysts still debate the complex and controversial international politics of this era. Was Thailand's policy towards the Khmer Rouge remnants a pragmatic act of national security, an attempt to create a buffer against what they saw as Vietnamese expansionism? Or was it a policy that inadvertently prolonged the Cambodian Civil War and the suffering of the Cambodian people by helping to keep the Khmer Rouge insurgency alive? Finally, in December of 1998, the last of the Khmer Rouge fighters at Preah Vihear surrendered to the Cambodian government. The long, dark night of the Cambodian Civil War and the genocide was at last over. The guns finally fell silent on the sacred mountain. For the first time in almost 30 years, the temple was at peace. The border was demilitarized. An era of cooperation seemed possible. Tourists began to trickle back, mostly accessing the site from the much easier Thai side. But the old dispute, the quiet, fundamental question of who truly owned the stones and the land they stood on, had not gone away. It had only been sleeping. And in the early 21st century, it was about to be awakened in a dramatic and forceful way. For nearly a decade after the end of the Civil War, the temple enjoyed a period of quiet and cautious cooperation. Tourists, mostly arriving via the much easier access route from the Thai side, would visit the magnificent ruins. A fragile, hopeful peace had returned to the sacred mountain. But in 2007, the Cambodian government, eager to secure international recognition and protection for its most prized landmark, decided to take a step that would inadvertently reignite the long-dormant fires of the old conflict. Cambodia announced its intention to apply to have the Temple of Preah Vihear listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. From the Cambodian perspective, this was a perfectly logical and proud move. The World Court had affirmed the temple was on their sovereign territory. It was, without question, a masterpiece of human creative genius, and a site of outstanding universal value. A UNESCO listing would bring international prestige, access to crucial funding for the temple's preservation, and a significant boost to the country's growing tourism industry. It was seen as a responsible act of a sovereign nation caring for its cultural heritage. The problem, as always, was the land. Any application to UNESCO requires a map, showing the boundaries of the site to be protected, and any map of the area around Preah Vihear was inherently a political statement. The application immediately brought the old, unresolved, and deeply sensitive issue of the surrounding territory roaring back to life. It was an act of cultural preservation that was immediately interpreted by many in Thailand as an act of political aggression. The process of trying to protect the temple for all humanity ended up making it a battlefield once again. It is a sad and complex irony. The World Heritage Committee, the body within UNESCO that makes these decisions, found itself in a difficult position. After a period of intense and often heated diplomatic negotiation between the two countries, the committee met in Quebec, Canada, in July of 2008 to make their final decision. The scene was surreal. Diplomats in sharp suits argued over ancient borders and Khmer iconography under the fluorescent lights of a modern convention center. Half a world away from the jungle-clad mountain they were discussing. In the end, the committee tried to find a compromise. They voted to officially inscribe the Temple of Preah Vihear as a World Heritage Site belonging to Cambodia. However, in a major concession to Thailand, they did so only on the condition that the inscription was for the temple monument itself. The sensitive issue of the land surrounding it, and the comprehensive management plan for the site, was deferred, left for the two countries to work out together at a later date. It was a solution that satisfied no one. The news of the decision sent shockwaves across Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, there were public celebrations. It was seen as a second great victory, a modern reaffirmation of their sovereignty over the temple, a moment of immense national pride. In Thailand, the reaction was one of fury. The decision was perceived as a diplomatic defeat, a loss of face, and a threat to what many Thais considered to be their own territory. And this public anger was about to be harnessed as a powerful weapon in a completely separate, domestic political battle. International heritage experts still debate the role of UNESCO in politically contested sites. Should the organization avoid listing sites that are the subject of active sovereignty disputes in order to avoid inflaming tensions? Or does it have a moral duty to recognize and protect sites of outstanding universal value, regardless of the political conflicts that may surround them? The Preah Vihear case is a textbook example of this difficult dilemma. The UNESCO listing had been intended to protect the temple's past. Instead, it had dangerously compromised its future. The decision made in the quiet air-conditioned rooms of a Canadian conference center was about to have very loud and very real consequences in the hot, tense jungle on the Cambodian-Thai border. The nationalist fire had been lit. The UNESCO committee's decision, made in a quiet conference room in Canada, landed like a lit match in the dry, volatile, and deeply polarized landscape of Thai domestic politics. To understand why an ancient temple suddenly became a modern crisis, we must for a moment look away from the remote border and towards the chaotic, protest-filled streets of the capital, Bangkok. The year 2008 was a time of intense political turmoil in Thailand. The country was bitterly divided between two main political factions, each identified by a color. On one side were the Yellow Shirts, known formally as the People's Alliance for Democracy, or PAD. They were a powerful coalition of royalists, urban elites, and conservative nationalists who were deeply opposed to the populist former Prime Minister, Thaksin Shinawatra. On the other side were the Red Shirts, the supporters of Thaksin, who were drawn mainly from the rural and working classes. Throughout 2008, the Yellow Shirts were engaged in a massive, prolonged campaign of street protests aimed at forcing the resignation of the government then in power, which they saw as a proxy for the exiled Thaksin. It was into this deeply divided and heated political atmosphere that the news of the Preah Vihear UNESCO listing arrived. And for the leaders of the Yellow Shirt movement, it was a perfect political gift. They seized upon the issue with a brilliant and relentless political instinct. They framed the government's initial, cautious cooperation with Cambodia on the UNESCO application as a treasonous act. They accused the Prime Minister of being weak, incompetent, and of selling out the nation's sovereign territory to its smaller neighbor. The ancient grievance from the 1962 court case, which had been dormant for decades, was deliberately and skillfully reawakened and transformed into a powerful weapon in a modern political fight. It is a political tactic as old as time. When you are struggling in a domestic political battle, you find an external enemy. You wrap yourself in the flag, you speak of national honor, and you accuse your opponents of being unpatriotic. In the summer of 2008, the ancient temple of Preah Vihear became the perfect symbol for this kind of nationalist politics. The leaders of the Yellow Shirt movement, many of whom were also powerful media figures, used their television stations, newspapers, and websites to broadcast a constant stream of emotional and often inflammatory rhetoric about the loss of the temple. They organized large-scale protests in Bangkok and even bused thousands of their supporters to the remote border region to protest at the temple site itself, an ancient dispute, which for decades had been the quiet domain of diplomats and historians, was now the headline story on the nightly news, every single night. The quiet, sacred mountain had been dragged into the loud, angry, and brightly lit world of a modern media war. Political scientists who study Thailand still debate the true source of this nationalist fervor. Was it a genuine grassroots movement, a spontaneous outpouring of public anger that the Yellow Shirt leaders simply tapped into? Or was it a more cynical, elite-driven phenomenon, where political leaders deliberately manufactured the crisis, using their powerful media platforms to stoke nationalist feelings for their own domestic political gain? Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The immense public and media pressure forced the Thai government's hand. To avoid looking weak and unpatriotic in the face of the protests, the government had no choice but to abandon its earlier, more cooperative stance. They adopted a much harder, more confrontational line with Cambodia, withdrew their support for the joint management of the site, and, crucially, dispatched the Thai military to the border to protect Thai sovereignty. It is a tragic and sadly common story in international relations. A dispute that might have been solved quietly through calm diplomacy becomes impossible to resolve, because it is now being performed on a public stage. On this stage, any attempt at compromise is seen as a betrayal, and any small concession is seen as a humiliating surrender. The domestic political conflict in Thailand had now successfully created a full-blown international crisis. But how did this look from the other side of the border? While the political firestorm raged in Bangkok, the view from the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh, was very different. To understand the escalating crisis, we must now cross the disputed borderline in our minds and look at the situation from the Cambodian perspective. For the government and the people of Cambodia, their actions had been entirely logical, peaceful, and correct according to international law. The matter of who owned the temple of Preah Vihear was not a question for debate. It had been settled, completely and irrevocably, by the International Court of Justice in 1962. The temple was theirs. From this viewpoint, the application for UNESCO World Heritage status was not an act of aggression or provocation. It was a natural and responsible step for a sovereign nation to take. They were the legal custodians of a masterpiece of human creative genius, and they felt a duty to the world to have it recognized and to secure the international assistance needed for its preservation and repair. The political chaos that this act had unleashed in Thailand was seen not as a legitimate grievance, but as a dangerous and irrational domestic problem that was now spilling across the border. There was also a profound sense of the asymmetry of power. Cambodia is a smaller nation than Thailand, with a smaller economy and a less powerful military. Their primary weapon on the world stage had always been international law and diplomacy, the very tools that had won them the temple in the first place. The sudden arrival of the Thai military at the border was therefore seen as a deeply intimidating and aggressive act of bullying. It felt like their larger neighbor, having lost the argument in court, was now trying to win it with the threat of force. From the Cambodian point of view, the situation was bewildering and deeply unfair. They had followed all the international rules. They had won the World Court case. They had, after much effort, secured the UNESCO listing. And now, because of a political argument happening in their neighbor's capital, they were facing a full-blown military standoff on their own sovereign territory. This firm stance was also deeply rooted in Cambodia's recent, traumatic history. The nation was still recovering from the decades of civil war and the unimaginable horror of the Khmer Rouge genocide. For a country that had lost so much of its population and its cultural heritage, the magnificent temples of their ancient golden age were incredibly powerful symbols. Preah Vihear was not just a pile of old stones. It was a symbol of national survival, of a glorious past, and of a resilient people's hopes for a stable and prosperous future. The threat to the temple was perceived as a threat to their very national recovery. This commitment had been demonstrated in a very physical way. For decades, the only easy way for anyone, including Cambodian citizens, to visit their own great temple was by going through Thailand. In the early 2000s, the Cambodian government had invested a huge amount of money and effort into building a new, difficult road up the steep, 1,000-foot cliff face. It was a clear and powerful statement that this temple was an integral and accessible part of their nation. Imagine being a young Cambodian soldier, sent up this new road to stand guard in the ancient, carved galleries of the temple. You see the official UNESCO World Heritage plaque. You have been taught in school that the World Court has ruled this place belongs to your country, and you look across a few hundred yards of jungle at the army of another nation. For you, the situation is not a complex legal dispute about a 50-year-old map. It is a simple and sacred duty. You are defending your home. And so the two sides stood entrenched in their two completely irreconcilable realities. Thailand saw a historical injustice, a flawed colonial map, and a threat to its territorial integrity. Cambodia saw a settled legal fact, a defense of its national sovereignty, and an act of intimidation by a larger neighbor. With both sides so utterly convinced of the righteousness of their own cause, and with their armies now deployed barrel to barrel, the quiet, tense standoff was about to erupt into open conflict. The standoff on the sacred mountain, born of modern political anger and fueled by deep-seated nationalism, could not last forever. For months, the two armies faced each other across a few hundred yards of disputed jungle, a situation of high tension and fragile peace. And then, in October of 2008, the quiet was finally and tragically broken by the sound of gunfire. For the next 3 years, from late 2008 to the summer of 2011, the area around Preah Vihear became an active conflict zone. It was not a full-scale, declared war, but a series of intermittent, low-intensity, but often deadly, armed skirmishes. These clashes would flare up, last for a few days, and then subside into another tense ceasefire. The fighting involved exchanges of rifle and machine gun fire, and in the most intense periods, mortars and artillery shells. These were not bloodless conflicts. Soldiers on both sides were killed and wounded. Civilians in the small villages near the border were forced to flee their homes. And the ancient temple, the very object of this profound and passionate dispute, was caught in the crossfire. This is the ultimate, heartbreaking irony of the conflict. In the fight to determine who was the rightful protector of this priceless piece of shared heritage, both sides ended up damaging it. Stray bullets chipped away at the 1,000-year-old sandstone carvings. Shrapnel from exploding shells scarred the ancient walls. During one of the heaviest exchanges of fire in 2011, a wing of one of the main gateway pavilions was reported to have collapsed. The ancient stones, which had survived a millennium of monsoon rains and the slow, quiet encroachment of the jungle, were now being wounded by the very people who claimed to revere them the most. The conflict played out not just in the jungle, but in the media. Unlike the dispute of 1962, this was a battle fought in the age of 24-hour news and the internet. Both the Thai and Cambodian governments issued a constant stream of press releases, each side accusing the other of firing first, of violating their sovereignty, of being the aggressor. These reports, often highly nationalistic and inflammatory, were broadcast nightly in Bangkok and Phnom Penh, fueling the anger and hardening the positions of their own people. The old ghosts of history had found a powerful new amplifier and a uniquely modern complication. The digital border on Google Maps even became a point of contention. Both governments were reported to have lobbied Google, asking the company to use a line on its popular mapping service that supported their own territorial claim. In the past, a border was defined by a treaty or a line on a paper map. In the 21st century, the border must also be correct on the internet. Military analysts and international relations experts still debate the strategic objectives of these skirmishes. Were they genuine attempts by either side's military to gain a tactical advantage on the ground? Or were they a form of performative conflict, a way for the military and political leaders on both sides to demonstrate their patriotic resolve to their passionate domestic audiences, without having to risk the immense costs of a full-scale war? The fighting at a newly inscribed UNESCO World Heritage Site drew immediate and widespread international condemnation. The United Nations Security Council and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, both called for a permanent ceasefire and a peaceful resolution to the dispute. The world was watching, and the pressure was mounting on both nations to stop the violence. The UNESCO listing, which had been the catalyst for the conflict, now ironically became a tool for its potential resolution. By declaring the temple a piece of World Heritage, it was no longer just a private argument between two countries. The entire global community now had a stake in its protection. But the diplomatic efforts failed. The situation remained at a dangerous and deadly stalemate. It became clear that the two nations, caught in their own cycles of domestic politics and nationalist pride, were unable to solve the problem on their own. And so, Cambodia decided to once again turn to the only institution that had ever provided a clear and binding answer. They decided to go back to court. With the diplomatic process stalled and soldiers dying on the border of a World Heritage Site, Cambodia played its final card. In April of 2011, at the height of the military clashes, they filed an urgent request with the International Court of Justice in The Hague. They were asking the court to step back into the 50-year-old dispute that it was a clever legal strategy. They were not asking for a new trial. The 1962 verdict was final and legally binding. Instead, they were requesting an interpretation of that verdict. They argued that the two countries had a fundamental disagreement about what the original judgment actually meant, specifically in relation to the land immediately surrounding the temple promontory. And this disagreement, they argued, was now causing an active and deadly armed conflict, which threatened the very fabric of the temple the court had sought to protect. Before the court could even consider the main case for interpretation, it had to address the immediate violence. In July of 2011, it issued a legally binding provisional order. The order was a powerful and direct intervention. It commanded both Thailand and Cambodia to immediately withdraw all military personnel from a newly created Provisional Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, of about 17 square kilometers around the temple. It also called for observers from the regional body, ASEAN, to be allowed into the area to monitor the ceasefire. The court, in its slow, deliberate way, had acted with surprising speed and force. It had essentially told both sides, "You will immediately stop fighting over this sacred place while we, the judges, take the time to think." It was a legally mandated timeout for two nations in conflict. After some initial resistance and political maneuvering, both sides eventually and gradually complied. The soldiers pulled back from their frontline positions. The guns fell silent. The immediate crisis was over. The final verdict on the interpretation of the 1962 judgment was delivered in November of 2013. The populations of both Cambodia and Thailand watched the proceedings live on television, a moment of immense national tension. The court's final decision was a masterpiece of careful judicial diplomacy. First, it reaffirmed that Cambodia held sovereignty over the entire promontory of Preah Vihear. Second, it clarified that this meant Cambodia also had sovereignty over the land at the base of the hill. However, it did not draw a new definitive borderline on a map, leaving that task to the two nations to work out together. Crucially, it ordered Thailand not to obstruct Cambodia's access to the temple, and it called on both parties to cooperate in the protection of the World Heritage Site. The ruling was so nuanced that both governments were able to present it to their domestic audiences as a partial victory, a crucial factor in preventing a new wave of nationalist outrage. The Cambodian government could celebrate that their sovereignty over the entire temple promontory had been confirmed. The Thai government could claim that the court had not awarded all of the disputed 4.6 square kilometers of land to Cambodia. It was a verdict designed not just to be legally correct, but to be politically survivable for both governments, a masterclass in judicial diplomacy aimed at calming the waters. International relations experts still study this conflict as a key example of how international legal bodies like the ICJ can, and cannot, resolve these deep-seated nationalist disputes. Can a court truly solve a problem that is fundamentally about national identity, historical memory, and powerful emotions? Or is its primary and most effective role simply to manage the conflict and prevent it from escalating into a wider war, as its 2011 order did so effectively? Following the 2013 verdict, and with a new, more stable political situation in Thailand, the long and bitter crisis finally came to an end. The guns fell silent. The lawyers went home. The ancient temple, which had once again found itself at the center of a very modern and very loud argument, could finally return to its preferred state, quiet. And so, the lawyers and the soldiers finally depart. The television cameras are turned off, and the harsh lights of the 24-hour news cycle turn to other, newer crises. The Temple of Preah Vihear, after its brief, violent, and chaotic appearance on the world stage, is allowed to return to a state of peace. Imagine you are there now, in the quiet of the present day. The demilitarized zone is in effect. The air is no longer tense with the threat of conflict. The only sound is the high, lonely whisper of the wind as it sweeps across the clifftop. The slow, patient work of repairing the damage from the skirmishes, and from the long centuries of neglect, is underway, often with the quiet assistance of international heritage groups. The fundamental paradox of the temple's geography remains. The easy, gentle path still leads up from the Thai side. The steep, difficult climb still faces Cambodia. Access to the site remains a complex issue, a source of ongoing, but now peaceful negotiation. The temple has become a lesson in itself. A lesson that a hard line on a map is a simple, and sometimes brutal thing, but that life on the ground is complex and requires conversation and cooperation. The two nations must now work together to protect the very thing they once fought over. The story of Preah Vihear is a powerful and cautionary tale for our modern world. It is a story about how potent and how dangerous the mixture of ancient history and modern nationalism can be. It shows how easily a shared, sacred symbol can be transformed into a tool of division by politics, how a place of peace can be made into a landscape of fear. International heritage experts continue to watch Preah Vihear as a test case. Can a site with such a contentious recent history become a true peace park, a model for transboundary cooperation and shared heritage? Or will the deep-seated nationalist feelings that were so easily awoken on both sides remain a dormant threat, a sleeping dragon waiting for the next political crisis to be prodded awake? For now, there is peace. The temple stands as it has for 1,000 years, a silent witness to history. It has survived the rise and fall of the great Khmer Empire that built it. It has survived the drawing of colonial maps, the solemn verdicts of distant world courts, and the sound of modern gunfire echoing in its sacred galleries. It endures, and there it stands, a sanctuary in the clouds, its stone causeways leading to the sky. And with this image of quiet, patient endurance, our long and complex story of borders, and of the passions they inspire, comes to its gentle close. The memory of the magnificent Khmer architecture, the image of the flawed line on the old French map, the sound of the judge's gavel in a distant European courtroom, and the sad, faint echo of gunfire in a holy place, all of these can now begin to fade, to settle into the quiet dust of history. The crisis is over. The soldiers have gone home. The temple is safe, resting in the clouds, looking out over the Great Plains. There is nothing left to resolve. There is only the peace that comes at the end of a long and difficult story. And now you can rest.